Because we hadn't lived through it, there is no real way for us to completely understand what it meant to be an American during the Great Depression. The closest way we can experience what others have gone through is by reading first-hand accounts. The website Facing History, which you are looking at right now, includes interviews conducted by studs circle of people of all walks of life who had lived through the Great Depression. This is a very important website because it includes very useful primary sources that can provide us with a new perspective on the Great Depression. There are excerpts from 3 separate interviews on this website, and each one focuses on a different topic concerning the Great Depression. The first person Studs Circle interviewed was Virginia Jurr, who later became a civil rights activist, and she talked about the shame and humiliation people experienced, including herself, during the Great Depression. She said as follows, "It was a time of terrible suffering. The contradictions were so obvious that it didn't take a very bright person to realize something was terribly wrong. Have you ever seen a child with rickets, shaking as with palsy, no protein, no milk, and the companies pouring milk into gutters, people with nothing to wear, and the were plowing up cotton, people with nothing to eat, and they killed the pigs. If that wasn't the craziest system in the world, can you imagine anything more idiotic? This was just insane." And people blamed themselves, not the system. They felt they had been at fault. If we hadn't bought that old radio, if we hadn't bought that old second-hand car. Among the things that horrified me were the preachers, the fundamentalists. They would tell the people they suffered because of their sins, and the people believed it. God was punishing them. Their children were starving because of their sins. People who were independent, who thought they were masters and mistresses of their lives, were all of a sudden dependent on others, relatives or relief. People of pride went into shock and sanatoriums. My mother was one. Up to this time, I had been a conformist, a Southern snob. I actually thought the only people who amounted to anything were the very small group which I belonged to. The fact that my family wasn't as well off as those of the girls I went with, I was vice president of the junior league, made me value even more the idea of being well-born. What I learned during the Depression changed all that. I saw a blinding light like Saul on the road to Damascus. It was the first time I had seen the other side of the tracks, the rickets, the pellagra. It shook me. I saw the world as it really was. The Depression affected people in 2 different ways. The great majority reacted by thinking money is the most important thing in the world. Get yours, and get it for your children. Nothing else matters. Not having that dark terror come at you again. And then there was a small number of people who felt that the whole system was lousy. You have to change it. The kids come along and they want to change it too, but they don't seem to know what to put in its place. I'm not so sure I know either. I do think it has to be responsive to people's needs, and it has to be done by democratic means, if possible. So by reading Virginia Jurr's personal account, we had learned something about the Great Depression that we may have not known otherwise. We learned how people blamed themselves oftentimes, or they thought it was a punishment from God, or they realized that they thought money was the most important thing in the world, and how the whole system needs to be changed and revolutionized. This is also only an account from one person, though, so it could be very different for other people. So let's move on to the next one. Eileen Barth worked as a caseworker in Chicago. Her job was to work with those who needed government assistance during the Great Depression. In one case, a family asked for government assistance in getting clothing, and Barth was instructed by her supervisor to look in their closets to determine how badly they needed the clothing they asked for. She described what happened. I'll never forget one of the first families I visited. The father was a railroad man who had lost his job. I was told by my supervisor that I really had to see the poverty. If a family needed clothing, I was to investigate how much clothing they had at hand. So I looked into this man's closet. He was a tall, gray-haired man, though not terribly old. He let me look in his closet. He was so insulted. He said, "Why are you doing this?" I remember his feeling of humiliation, the terrible humiliation. He said, "I really haven't anything to hide, but if you really must look into it." I could see he was very proud. He was also so deeply humiliated, and I was too. Through Eileen's personal account, we see a different view of the Great Depression. We see someone who has a higher standing and has helped those who are down on their luck or don't have as much means as others. She also talked about the humiliation she saw other people felt. Can you imagine having to justify your poverty? to have to invite someone to your home and show them how little you have just so you can get a helping hand? It's accounts such as this that lets us get a glimpse into a world we might have not known otherwise. Finally, Emma Tiller described sharecropping during the Depression. In 1929, me and my husband were sharecroppers. We made a crop that year, the owners taking all of the crop. This horrible way of living, with almost nothing, lasted up until Roosevelt. There was another strangest thing. I didn't suffer for food through the 30s, because there was plenty of people that really suffered much worse. When you go through a lot, you're in better condition to survive through all these kinds of things. I picked cotton. We weren't getting but 35 cents a hundred, but I was able to make it, because I also worked people's homes, where they give you old clothes and shoes. At this time, I worked in private homes a lot, and when the white people kill hogs, they always get the Negroes to help. The cleaning of the insides and the clean up the mess afterwards. And then they would give you a lot of scraps, a pretty adequate amount of meat for the whole family. The majority of Negroes on the farm were in the same shape we were in. The crops were eaten by these worms, and they had no other jobs except farming. In 1934, in this Texan town, the farmers was all out of food. The government gave us a slip where you can pick up food. For a week, they had people who would come and stand in line, and they couldn't get waited on. This was a small town, mostly white. Only 5 of us in that line were Negroes. The rest was white. We would stand all day and wait and wait and wait, and get nothing, or if you did, it was spoiled meat. The government sent 2 men out there to find out why the trouble. They found out his man and a couple others had rented a huge warehouse and was stacking that food and selling it. The food that was supposed to be issued to these people. These 3 men were sent to the pen. Okay. So in this first-hand account by Emma Tiller, we learned about an African-American woman and the struggles she faced. And despite all the bad she's going through, she still says it's not that bad because she's experienced worse and she thinks that makes her tougher. So that's a really interesting perspective to get on the Great Depression. Also, through the last paragraph when they talk about the spoiled food they were getting and how they found out people were actually selling the food they were supposed to be getting, they learned about all the corruption that actually still existed during the time of the Great Depression and how people were still taking advantage of each other in this time of hardship. So as I have mentioned, this is just a really interesting website that allows you to see first-hand accounts and learn more about the Great Depression through the eyes of people who actually lived it. And we'll talk about it more in class tomorrow, but if there's any questions, just think of them now and bring them up to me tomorrow. Thanks, guys.